There's a moment, a crack in the noise of life where everything quiets down, not outside of us, but within. This silence is not empty, it roars. It's the moment we begin to remember who we truly are. Not the version people expected us to become, not the mask we wore to survive, but the one God intended from the very beginning. I've felt that crack open in me. Maybe you have too. It's subtle at first. A restlessness. A strange hunger that no accomplishment, no applause, no relationship can satisfy. And if you felt that ache, that unnameable calling tugging from deep within your chest, you're not broken. You're waking up. You're becoming dangerous to everything false. That's one of the first signs. You stop fitting in. Not because you're flawed, but because you're real. You're not here to decorate the world's delusions. You're here to transform them. But how do we know if we're really on this path? What are the signs that we're becoming the strongest version God intended? Not just strong in body, not just tough in mind, but dangerously aligned in soul. There comes a shift, quiet but seismic, when you no longer panic in the presence of pain. You begin to welcome it, not because you're masochistic, but because something within you now knows every ounce of pain has purpose. You're no longer afraid to feel. You stop running from discomfort and instead you turn toward it. Like a warrior walking into a storm with eyes wide open. When others numb, you listen. When others distract, you breathe. And slowly the pain alchemizes. It becomes wisdom, insight, compassion. That strength, that's not from a gym. That's not from hustle culture. That is spiritual muscle. And God only builds that in the hidden places where no one claps, where no one sees. Ask yourself, when was the last time pain taught you, instead of tormenting you? What if the strongest version of you isn't the one that escapes suffering, but the one who learns to walk through fire untouched? That kind of strength leaves an imprint on the universe. Another unmistakable sign, you stop outsourcing your worth. It's like one day you wake up and realize, wait, I don't need anyone's permission to exist anymore. You stop begging for seats at tables where your soul was never meant to dine. You stop shrinking to fit into containers that were never made for your expansion. You become dangerous to systems of control and manipulation because you no longer need validation to feel valuable. You don't chase it, you embody it. You become the kind of presence that walks into a room and shifts the atmosphere, not because you're loud, but because you are anchored. People don't always understand it. Some will be drawn to you. Others will be intimidated. That's okay. You're not here to be understood. You're here to be authentic. And in a world addicted to approval, authenticity is rebellion. How many masks are you still wearing to be accepted by people you don't even respect? Are you courageous enough to take them all off, even if it means standing alone? Then something even stranger happens. You begin to crave truth more than comfort. You stop asking, does this feel good? And start asking, is this true? And that's when the real spiritual warfare begins. Because truth doesn't just liberate, it disrupts. It shakes foundations. It exposes illusions. It demands sacrifice. You find yourself shedding beliefs, identities, narratives you once clung to like lifeboats, but now they feel like chains. You're no longer seduced by shallow positivity. You want depth. You want God, not just a God that fits your preferences. The strongest version of you doesn't worship comfort. It worships reality, even when it's inconvenient, even when it hurts, even when it costs you everything. Are you willing to lose the world's version of success to gain your soul's alignment? Are you willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of becoming real? There's a sacred madness that begins to stir in your spirit. You start seeing things others don't. You sense energy in a room before a word is spoken. You feel people's intentions beneath their words. You cry without knowing why. You laugh during chaos. You feel alive in places that once made you numb. That's not insanity. That's sensitivity. That's discernment. That's spiritual intelligence. You're no longer asleep to the unseen. God is tuning your inner frequency. And now you can't ignore the invisible. You can't pretend like the spiritual realm isn't real. You know it is. You feel it in your bones. You hear the whispers between the words. You see the patterns behind the chaos. And that knowing, that's your compass now. You don't just live from logic. You live from alignment, from intuition, from spirit. Can you trust that? Even when it makes no sense to your mind? Even when it requires a leap into the unknown? Then there's a sign that most people won't tell you about, because it doesn't look glamorous. It looks like loss, like things falling apart, friendships ending, careers crumbling, seasons closing. But listen closely, not every ending is a failure. Sometimes it's a birthing. You don't become the strongest version God intended by holding on to everything. You become it by letting go, by trusting the pruning, by believing that what's leaving your life is making room for what's meant to grow. This is spiritual maturity, when you no longer curse the collapse. You honor it. You bless the death before the resurrection, and you whisper thank you even as your heart breaks. Because you know God is not cruel. God is clearing space. Can you trust what's leaving? Can you stop grasping and start receiving? That's what turns wounds into wombs. Finally, you begin to live with a quiet fire. You don't need to prove yourself anymore. You don't need to be the loudest in the room. You don't need to explain your path to people who can't see it. You just walk it. You become the message. You embody the frequency. You radiate the truth, and people feel it. They may not understand what changed in you, but they'll feel safer, lighter, more seen in your presence. That's real power, not domination, not control, but presence. The strongest version God intended is anchored, aware, and awake. You become a mirror for others to see themselves more clearly. You become a doorway, a disruption, a reminder. And maybe that's what we're really doing here, not just becoming better people, but becoming portals for heaven to touch earth. Can you see yourself as that? Can you hold the weight of that calling? The path of sacred power, when God turns your wounds into weapons. There's a moment on the spiritual path where you stop asking, why did this happen to me? And you start asking, what is this trying to make of me? That shift is not subtle, it's seismic. It's the death of the victim and the birth of the vessel. It's when you realize your deepest wounds were never meant to destroy you. They were meant to forge you. Like fire forges steel, like pressure forms diamonds. You begin to see that the pain you thought would bury you actually became the soil where your purpose was planted. And that's the paradox of divine strength. It doesn't come from escaping suffering. It comes from transmuting it. You become the strongest version God intended, not by being untouchable, but by becoming unbreakable, because you've already been broken and rebuilt by the hands of grace. Ask yourself, what if the very thing you thought disqualified you is actually the thing that qualifies you to lead, to heal, to awaken others? We all carry scars, some visible, some buried deep in the soul. But when you're walking the path of sacred power, those scars stop being secrets. They become scriptures. Not the kind written in ink, but in blood, in tears, in resilience. You begin to understand your story is not a shame. It's a sermon. Every abandonment, every betrayal, every failure, it all becomes holy ground. Nothing is wasted in the hands of God. Not even your mistakes. Especially not your mistakes. That's how divine power flows, not through your perfection, but through your surrender. Through your willingness to be seen in your entirety. Because when you stop hiding your wounds, your presence becomes healing for others. You stop being a performer and start being a presence. a living, breathing testimony that God can resurrect anything. Have you ever looked at your pain and asked, how can this be used for love? That question can unlock your destiny. As you walk deeper, a strange kind of clarity begins to dawn. You start to see people, not just their words or actions, but their essence. You recognize the masks they wear, not with judgment, but with compassion, because you wore them too. You sense their fear behind their pride, their longing behind their anger. You become less reactive and more reflective. That's wisdom. That's spiritual maturity. You no longer need to fight every battle. You realize that not every conflict requires your energy. Sometimes silence is the sharpest sword. Sometimes walking away is the loudest roar. And in that restraint, in that sacred stillness, you become a force that cannot be manipulated. You don't need to win arguments, you are the argument. You don't need to scream your power, you radiate it. Can you feel the difference between reaction and revelation? Between ego and essence? That's when you know you're standing in the truth of who you are. Then comes the calling. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It comes quietly like a whisper in the wilderness. But once it speaks, you cannot unhear it. It says, now is the time. Time to stop hiding. Time to stop dimming. Time to stop negotiating with doubt. You feel it in your bones. You are born for something more. Not more status, not more possessions, but more impact, more truth, more light. You begin to feel a sacred urgency, not the rush of the world, but the pulse of purpose. You realize this life is not a rehearsal. You weren't sent here to survive. You were sent here to ignite, to awaken, to build the kingdom in every interaction, every room you walk into, every word you speak. That's when your life stops being about you and starts being about what's moving through you. Are you ready to stop playing small? Are you ready to answer the call, even if it costs you comfort? And make no mistake, it will cost you. The stronger you become, the more you're called to walk alone. Not because you're unworthy of love, but because not everyone can walk at your altitude. What once felt like belonging now feels like betrayal to your soul. You begin to crave solitude, not loneliness, but sacred aloneness. You realize that silence is not empty, it's full. Full of God, full of instruction, full of recalibration. In solitude, you meet yourself again. You remember your original essence before the world told you who to be. And from that place, you start to rebuild. Not based on fear, not based on survival, but based on truth, anchored in spirit, rooted in eternity. Can you sit in the silence long enough to hear the voice beneath the noise? Can you let God form you in the dark before He reveals you in the light? This is not the journey of the many. This is the path of the initiated, the ones who are willing to be emptied so they can be filled, who are willing to be broken so they can become whole, who are willing to be misunderstood so they can be aligned. You will lose people. You will lose versions of yourself, but you will gain clarity. You will gain peace. You will gain a power that doesn't come from titles or followers, but from the throne room itself. And you'll begin to notice people start coming to you not for advice, but for presence. They feel something in you that has weight, substance, glory. And you'll know it's not about you, it's about who you've allowed to move through you. Are you willing to be a vessel, even if it means being broken open first? And then, finally, you realize something profound. Becoming the strongest version God intended isn't about becoming more. It's about becoming less. Less ego, less fear, less attachment. And as you empty, God fills. As you surrender, God builds. As you release, God reveals. What's left is not a perfect person, but a purified one. Not a flawless human, but a faithful one. You become a mirror that reflects God's nature. You become a fire that warms and refines. You become a sanctuary for others to remember who they are. And that is the ultimate strength, to carry the divine within you, not as a concept, but as a lived frequency. When you walk into a room, heaven walks in with you. When you speak, chains break. When you love, walls fall. That's who you really are. That's what you were always meant to be. Can you receive that? Can you remember? Heaven's warrior. When your presence becomes a portal for divine impact. There comes a time in the journey, rare and sacred, when you stop trying to do and start learning how to be. Not passive, not idle, but present, fully, fiercely, unapologetically here. You realize that your presence, when aligned, is not just energy. It's impact, it's activation, it's divine electricity. You walk into rooms and atmospheres shift. People soften or squirm not because of what you say, but because of what you carry. And what you carry is not of this world. You've become a portal, a walking intersection between heaven and earth. And here's the most humbling part. You didn't earn it by striving. You became it by surrendering. You stopped trying to prove your worth and instead became available to God's will. You allowed yourself to be emptied so you could be filled. You allowed yourself to die so you could be resurrected. Ask yourself, what would change if you truly believed your presence alone could be a ministry? Would you still hide? The strongest version of you isn't loud. It's luminous. It doesn't need attention. It commands respect through purity, through peace, through unwavering alignment. You stop being reactive to the chaos around you because you've become governed by a deeper rhythm. You're no longer led by impulse, but by instruction. You don't move because of pressure or panic, you move because of prompting. You've learned how to listen. And because you listen, you speak less, but your words carry weight. They don't just inform, they transform. People leave conversations with you remembering who they are. Not because you gave them advice, but because you embodied truth. And that embodiment, that's the fruit of secret places, of battles no one saw, of nights where you wrestled with God and refused to let go until the blessing came. That's the power of a person who didn't quit when the world told them to bow. And then something beautiful happens. Your life stops being about you. You stop obsessing over your image, your brand, your timeline. You stop comparing your calling to someone else's. You realize impact isn't about scale, it's about surrender. The widow with 2 coins gave more than the rich man with millions. Why? Because God measures weight, not width. And you start to realize every moment is sacred when you're aligned. Every conversation becomes a chance to plant seeds. Every act of kindness becomes a spiritual revolution. You start seeing the divine in the mundane. Washing dishes becomes worship. Walking your dog becomes prayer. Listening to a friend becomes intercession. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is random. You become a conduit through which God moves in subtle, seismic ways. Are you willing to let your ordinary life become an extraordinary altar? The spiritual warrior doesn't fight with fists. They fight with frequency, with love so pure it disarms hate, with peace so deep it stills storms, with truth so sharp it slices through deception. And here's the secret, that kind of power can't be faked. It's forged. It's born in obscurity, in silence, in obedience. You become a warrior when you realize your fight isn't against people. It's against everything that tries to disconnect people from who they really are. You're not here to dominate. You're here to liberate, to break illusions, to bring light, to carry the sword of spirit and the balm of compassion. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more presence. Can you be that? Can you walk into chaos and radiate calm? Can you look hatred in the face and respond with truth, not to win, but to free? And here's where it gets real. When you become the strongest version God intended, you will be tested. Not to punish you, but to prove you, to refine you, to reveal the depth of your roots. You'll be misunderstood, misjudged, maybe even mocked. But you'll know you're aligned when their rejection doesn't shake you, when their praise doesn't seduce you, when you stand rooted in who you are and whose you are. That's when you become immovable, not because you're hard, but because you're anchored. Anchored in truth, anchored in love, anchored in eternity. And from that place, nothing can pull you off course. Not temptation, not applause, not fear. You've tasted something deeper. You've seen behind the veil. And once you've seen it, you can't go back. Are you ready to be trusted with that kind of weight? Eventually, you realize that the greatest impact isn't made by the most visible people. It's made by the most available ones. Available to love when it's inconvenient. Available to serve when no one's watching. Available to obey when it doesn't make sense. You become the kind of person heaven can trust. Not because you're perfect, but because you're willing. Willing to be inconvenienced. Willing to be stretched. Willing to go deeper even when it hurts. And people will ask you, how are you so strong? And you'll smile because you know it's not your strength. It's borrowed. It's divine. It's the strength of someone who stopped trying and started trusting, who stopped performing and started partnering, who stopped running and rested in the arms of the one who called them. What would happen if your greatest goal wasn't success, but surrender? And finally, you realize the ultimate truth. The strongest version God intended is not a destination. It's a devotion, a daily choice, a continual becoming, a sacred dance between heaven's vision and your submission. You're not climbing a ladder. You're deepening a relationship. You're not building a platform. You're becoming a place where God can dwell. You are the temple. You are the vessel. You are the miracle someone else is praying for. And that reality humbles you. It silences your ego. It quiets your striving. And you begin to live in awe, not of yourself, but of the mystery that moves through you. You live with reverence, with gratitude, with fierce joy. And when you die, because all of us will, you won't wonder if you were enough. You'll know, I became the one God dreamed of when He breathed me into existence. And that, my friend, is the legacy of heaven's warrior. There's a sacred truth we rarely say aloud because it terrifies the ego and liberates the soul. You are not here to fit in. You are here to resonate, to reverberate the frequency of heaven into a world that has forgotten its original sound. Most people live in echoes of fear, scarcity, and shame, but you were designed to carry a new vibration, one that doesn't just speak, but awakens. And that awakening doesn't begin when you reach a certain level of spiritual performance. It begins the moment you remember. Remember that you were made in the image of the infinite, that your breath is sacred, that your presence is permission for others to rise, to feel, to hope again. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need a stage to be impactful. You just need to resonate truth, and the world will feel it, even if they don't know what changed. Have you forgotten the sound of your own soul? When you become the strongest version God intended, your life becomes less about impressing and more about imprinting. You start to care less about what people think of you and more about what God is doing through you. And you realize your life is a letter, not written in ink, but in energy, in presence, in the way you love, listen, forgive. You begin to understand that the strongest people are not the ones who never fall, but the ones who rise with grace again and again while holding space for others to do the same. You become the kind of person who sees a storm in someone's eyes and doesn't run, but stays. You become the kind of soul who walks into darkness carrying light, not to boast, but to bless. That's divine strength, not domination, but devotion. Are you willing to live a life that writes itself into eternity, even if no one on earth gives you credit? Something profound happens when you stop living from fear and start living from fullness. You stop reacting to life and start responding from spirit. You don't need to manipulate outcomes anymore. You trust the process. You trust God's timing. You trust the flow of grace. And because you're not chasing, you're anchored. You move with intention. You speak with clarity. You love without attachment. And you forgive without needing apology because you're no longer trying to win, you're trying to heal. That's not weakness. That's warfare of the highest kind. You don't need to flex spiritual pride. You embody spiritual authority. And that authority doesn't come from how many books you've read or how perfect your practices are. It comes from how deeply you've died to ego, how freely you've allowed God to use you. Can you live like that, not for applause, but for alignment? And then you begin to experience something wild and holy: synchronicity, divine timing, miraculous alignment. The right people show up, the right doors open, the provision arrives. Not because you forced it, but because you're walking in resonance. You're no longer striving, you're sourcing. You're tapped into something deeper than hustle. You're flowing in divine orchestration. And this doesn't mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes meaningful. Every challenge becomes a chance to deepen your trust. Every delay becomes a divine setup. You stop panicking when things don't go your way because you know if it's God's will, it's already yours. And if it's not, you don't want it. That's peace. That's power. That's the frequency of the strongest version of you. Can you trust the divine rhythm enough to dance even when you don't hear the music yet? Eventually, you stop needing to be right. You stop needing to win debates or prove your intelligence. You realize that the most powerful person in the room is often the one who listens the deepest, who sees the most, who loves the widest. You become a safe space for others to fall apart without shame. You become a mirror that reflects not their flaws, but their divine blueprint. And people will weep in your presence, not because of what you say, but because of what you see in them. That's the gift of presence. That's the fruit of becoming what God intended, not a warrior who crushes others, but one who restores them. Do you know how rare it is to be truly seen? Do you know how sacred it is to hold space for someone's becoming? What if your greatest impact isn't in what you do, but in the permission your presence gives others to awaken? And here's the mystery: the deeper you go, the lighter you become. Not because life gets easier, but because you're no longer carrying what doesn't belong to you. You stop carrying other people's expectations, timelines, projections. You stop carrying guilt for growing, shame for shining, fear for choosing yourself. You begin to walk lighter, speak softer, love harder. You become weightless, not because you're empty, but because you're free. The strongest version of you is the freest version. Free to obey God even when it's unpopular. Free to love people who may never love you back. Free to forgive without closure. Free to walk away without bitterness. Free to build without needing approval. That kind of freedom is dangerous to systems that profit from your captivity. Can you be that free, even if it means being misunderstood? And finally, we come full circle to the truth that has been whispering all along. You are not becoming something new. You are remembering what you've always been. Before the trauma, before the trauma, before the fear, you were divine intention wrapped in human form. You were purpose before you had words. You were power before you had pain. And now you've returned not to perfection but to presence, not to control but to co-creation. You've become the strongest version God intended, not because you're invincible but because you are available. Available to be used, available to be light, available to be love. And now your life is no longer yours, it's a living altar. And every breath you take is a prayer the universe can hear.